So now we begin our new topic, which is the English colonies in the 18th century. And it should be apparent to us that we spent a lot of time in the preceding periods, such as, well, we actually began, with earlier European colonization of the New World. And that provided us with a comparative angle by which to look at English migration to the New World and settlement beginning in the early 1600s. We discussed the various push and pull factors that were involved in influencing migration. And let's recall that at first survival was very precarious. But what you see happening are these settlements not only stabilizing, but actually becoming successful. And here, economics is crucial, right? You see eventually, especially by the 18th century, this new topic we're discussing, how these North American colonies and these large cities are going to be crucial commercial capitals for the English transatlantic trade system. Yet we also recognize that in the South, which is a different society, it's not a society with slaves, but again, a slave society. So slavery gets not only introduced, but we see that transition towards it being a full blown slave society. And of course, as we repeatedly acknowledge, this will leave an ineradicable effect upon our history. So again, enormous prosperity. And what we see as a result of this is profound economic growth, not to mention geographical and population growth. And again, we see this evolution really of the English colonies from these crude settlements in the beginning towards these bustling and vibrant commercial centers. And again, here we have to emphasize North America as not only a source of unfinished goods, but by this time, as it being a crucial market. The various places in the English North America, especially the large cities, like you see before you in that illustration, they're going to become important destinations for finished British goods, and the colonial population there will become crucial consumers of those goods. Okay, so again, that illustration before you could have been a depiction of any large city in Europe, but that is actually Philadelphia in the New World. So if we remember that 100 years earlier, it looked nothing like that, right? And then all of a sudden you see the city looking very modern, very much in league with some of these European cities. It reminds us how much growth is happening, and it definitely reminds us how the colonies become these self-assured, distinctive societies emerging in North America. And again, I have to remind you how that's such a unique occurrence that in the New World, you're having this place that in many ways looks like Europe, right? We take it for granted today that, especially in today's world with globalization, that you see trans national corporations. Well, even back then in the 1700s, you see economics flowing across the Atlantic Ocean, right? And again, you see these self-assured consumer societies there. Now, notice the slide. The years are from 1700 until 1763. So the period here is curtailed, obviously, and that's for a specific reason. Namely this, that 1763 is going to mark two things. It's going to mark the end of what's called the 7 Years' War, or in American history books, it's often referred to as the French Indian War. Okay. At the same time, it marks the beginning of the colonial crisis between the North American colonies and the mother country of England. Of course, that will culminate about 13 years after 1763 with the Declaration of Independence and then the subsequent American Revolutionary War. So that's why we curtail this as a sort of short decade, right? Ending in 1763. And of course, we're going to spend a lot of time on, both those things I just discussed. All right. So again, the major theme here is growth in 18th century America. And again, you'll see it economically, geographically, and certainly population. So let's first talk about population growth. What you're going to see here in North America is explosive population growth. Um, the colonial population would eventually, by this period, be much greater than Europe during the 1700s. And this is due to both factors involving natural population growth as well as immigration to the English colonies. So let's first talk about natural population growth. What you see happening here, as indicated in the slide, is higher life expectancy and correspondingly lower death rates. And this is due to a host of reasons. You see, for example, the absence of events like famines and epidemics. It's generally more healthier in North America than it is in the old world. In fact, even the diet overall was better in the new world than the old world. So what you have happening is, again, lower death rate, longer lives, and a youthful population actually. And then you put that together, that is to say, better life conditions and a youthful population, and you put that together with immigration. You see a steady influx, in other words, of immigrants during the 18th century. And notice on the slide, interestingly enough, many of these immigrants are non English. In fact, it's important to note this, as indicated in the slide, nearly half of the colonial population by 1763 would not be English, even though they were all the English colonies. So notice that we've been diverse from the very beginning. This history of ours, American history, has been marked by ethnic, religious, racial diversity from the formative stages of our history, interestingly enough. Now, as some examples of non English immigrants, we see the French Huguenots. And if you recall, the French Huguenots were basically Protestants in France that were persecuted due to their religious beliefs. So they decided to go to the New World as a place of refuge. But notice they don't go to, or many of them decide not to go to New France and the New World. No, they go to Pennsylvania, and this is for a certain reason, as we'll see also with the Pennsylvania Dutch and the Scots Irish. Pennsylvania, and eventually the middle colonies in general, would become an attractive destination due to William Penn's original philosophy that stuck around even through the 18th century, that welcomed all comers, regardless of background, regardless of religious beliefs and affiliation, regardless of socioeconomic status, so to speak. So this attracts other persons in Europe towards Pennsylvania. So one example is the French Huguenot. Another is the Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, these were not actually Dutch as we know today from, for example, the Netherlands. Actually, Dutch refers to present day Germany. But of course, back then, the 18th century, there was no such thing as Germany as a nation. Okay, Germany as a nation won't be formed until well into the 1800s. But basically, you have Germanic speakers around there in that area we call Germany today. And they would become attracted as well to Pennsylvania, especially. Now, the Pennsylvania Dutch also experienced persecution at that region for their religious beliefs. And not only that, they tended to be these farmers who were dispossessed and therefore seeking a better life, economically speaking. So what you have there is this sort of crude painting right here of Pennsylvania Dutch here. Okay, and that's the appropriate name, right? Pennsylvania. But again, Dutch really means Germanic tongue, so to speak, Germanic languages. You know, it's called Deutsch, right? German language is called Deutsch. Okay, so you have people settling in Pennsylvania, and I mentioned earlier that many of them were persecuted for their religious beliefs. Even today, if you go to Pennsylvania, you have interesting groups of Protestants, uh, like the Amish and the Mennonites, who still believe and cling to their way of life that, if you notice, they reject modern life in many ways, modernity, which is a big theme, right, of this course. We keep talking about the transition from pre-modern towards modern times, feudalism to capitalism, monarchy to democracy, and so on and so forth. Superstition and supernatural and religion towards that of science, right? And secularism. Well, the Amish would prefer the pre-modern way, and still today, if you look at this to the right, they prefer horse and buggies over the more modern cars, right? Why? Because cars are made in a factory, and it's modern economics. And still today, they build their own houses and make their own clothes. It's all homespun. So it's their ways basically that they're clinging on in Pennsylvania. Again, you could still find them there. But again, that's a outgrowth of this original movement of Pennsylvania Dutch living there, and they would become very successful farmers actually. Now, we also see another group of Europeans, and that's the Scots Irish. Let me first say that these are not Irish persons. They're not ethnic Irish. They're not even Catholic, okay? They're actually originally Scottish, and their religious affiliation was Presbyterianism. And why do they refer to themselves as Scots Irish, however? Well, this is a map of Ireland. Of course, Scotland is over here. You see at some point some Scottish persons, Scottish population, migrating to this northern province in Ireland called Ulster. And they would establish their community there, but they would be persecuted. Okay, they're not Catholic. And if you know anything about Ireland, it's predominantly Catholic. So, due again to religious as well as economic reasons, the New World being the land of opportunity, even back then in the 18th century, you see them being attracted to the New World, and therefore they will make the trek like many others. So that's the Scots Irish again. Originally Scottish, and they're not Irish. Let's remember that. Okay. By the way, they would become famous, or maybe the word is infamous, for the traits that they supposedly possess. Some of them not so good traits, like hard drinkers and supposedly undisciplined and uncouth. Okay. But at the same time, they were known as being very courageous in terms of their willingness to explore and even settle in the margins of a European settlement, right? The very fringes where literally their back door might be some hostile natives there. So that depiction on the right there is one of a Scots-Irish family on the frontier. And indeed, they would acquire that reputation as being tough, right? Though, hard drinkers and undisciplined. And by the way, one of the first persons elected to office in the executive branch, that is to say, president, that would not be English would be a Scots-Irish person, and that's Andrew Jackson. Okay, and obviously he's done our $20 bill today, so he has this legacy that we will discuss in this course. But notice that the fact that you have a non quote Anglo-Saxon, meaning English person, elected by popular vote to the highest office in the land bespeaks the degree to which democracy is working in even the republic once it formed, once we broke with the mother country of England. Okay, you actually have an ethnic minority, a Scots-Irish person, who, many of the English did not care for, right, actually voted by popular vote into the office. So when we think about immigration from Europe, and especially acknowledging the fact that, a lot of them, almost half of them, were immigrants from other parts of Europe and not England. Well, did they tend to go to the southern colonies? And the answer is no. I think it's obvious, right, that there are less opportunities available to them in the southern colonies, largely due to political economy. That is to say, you see their economic setup as plantation based, utilizing slave labor, and that slave labor, the system itself of slavery, is racialized, meaning that you don't see, for example, Irish slaves or Scottish slaves or uh, German slaves for that matter. Okay, so it's unique in that regard, and the South, by the way, is going to have a long history of lack of immigration well into the 20th century, and it has largely to do to this political economy in place, right? When you compare the immigration tradition of other parts like Chicago, New York, which have even ethnic neighborhoods of Italians and Polish and Jewish, you don't have large cities in the South until well into the 20th century, let alone ethnic neighborhoods. Okay, it just bespeaks the degree to which slavery actually determines that nature of growth in the South compared to other parts. All right, so you do see diversity, and that's a main theme here in the North and Middle colonies, but probably in the South, it's not as diverse. Now, add to the mix, of course, you have again African slaves, you have Native Americans, and this makes it overall a very diverse place racially and ethnically speaking. Now, notice on there in the slide, the population of the colonies grew tenfold from 265,000 at the turn of the 18th century towards that of 2.3 million. So that's astronomical in its population climb, right? And again, it's due to both natural factors and also immigration. Now, when you think about 18th century colonial America, you should always remember again that it's diverse, especially some regions like the middle parts, the middle colonies. You can't ignore the thriving commercialism there because, you know, uh, even during that time, many parts of Europe were still caught in the exhaust fumes of feudalism. So they weren't as commercial, right, as even the Americas. In many ways, colonial cities in North America were much more successful than many areas of Europe. But you always had this unknown frontier lurking in the background. And regardless of that, you see this impulse among many colonials to move west. So this is a very interesting place in, let's say, 1760, 63. A very interesting place in the world, relatively speaking. That is to say, the English colonies in America. Now, I've been discussing the middle colonies a lot here because they're such a big part of this growth during the 18th century in the English colonies. So you do see, of course, Pennsylvania still around, but you also see the addition of other colonies, and many of these would be gained from the Dutch Empire, okay, namely New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. So you put that together with Pennsylvania, and you have what we could now call the middle colonies, and still today we call them, the mid-Atlantic states, right? So this happens in the 18th century, and of course contributes to population growth, as mentioned. In fact, if you just look in the middle colonies alone, let's say between 1700 and 1763, you see the population being, almost negligible in the beginning, right? To increasing tenfold, 10 times, right? And again, a lot of that is due to immigration. Now, were there any slaves in the middle colonies? Yes, but very small percentage compared to the South, as you can imagine. Only about 7%. Why? Because again, it's the same reason why I discussed earlier. Less opportunities. Most of these areas, though very prosperous in farming, were not monocrop plantations. Okay, this might be a typical setup here. And this is a large farm by those standards back in the 18th century. You see all these houses in other areas and livestock here. And, this is what life was like if you were relatively well off in the middle colonies during the 18th century. Imagine compared to many parts of Europe where, again, it's still mired in that feudal way of life, where you have peasants struggling to survive. So again, the theme here is widespread prosperity. Okay, here we just discussed geographical growth, right? Middle colonies, and then we discussed population growth, and of course economic growth. Again, the middle colonies will add to the colonies as already a vibrant market for English goods. Okay, so overall, with a more youthful population again, um, you have a lower death rate, um, you have a higher standard of living. And this is all useful for this place as a consumerist society. So this is going to be a big theme for this topic, as well as future topics in the course. This notion of consumerism, the English colonials and the immigrants being avid consumers. Okay, this is very modern, obviously, a big part of modernity today, as I discussed throughout this course today. In today's world, we take consumerism for granted. That is to say, the market. And certainly, this is going to play an important role even in the American Revolution. We're going to see how the market is going to be used by the colonials. It's going to be actually weaponized, so to say, to use a term, in their quarrel against the mother country, right? They're going to decide, for example, to boycott and to not accept importations in revolt against, let's say, heightened tax rates. Okay, so we'll now move on to the next video.